In this tutorial we're going to cover the heel flap and heel turn on short circular needles. I have just finished the last round of my leg and removed my marker. I've only knit the leg to 3 inches because this is a demonstration sock, but hopefully you have knit yours to the size specified in the pattern. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat now about what we're going to be doing next. So your heel flap is knit in a lot of patterns on half of the stitches of your leg. So in this pattern I'm going to be knitting my heel flap on 22 stitches of my total 44. So on one side you're going to have your instep stitches and they are going to be left alone, so they're 22. And then you have the other 22 which will go on and become your heel flap. So you just get ready to work. There's something to note here though, is that you're going to be knitting your stocking stitch back and forth in rows rather than around and around. So that's one of the differences here, is that it's going to be stocking stitch, knit row, purl row as opposed to all knit rounds. So you're about to start and you place back your marker into the round work, and that is just going to tell you as you knit back where you are going to come back to, and you'll be taking it out in a minute. It'll become much clearer in a second. So the first thing you do is you knit across the 22 stitches that are going to make up your heel flap. Obviously if you are making a different size you will knit across the number of stitches specified in the pattern. So you just work these stitches as normally as if you were going to be knitting around, but obviously you don't continue once you've knit the 22 stitches. So we'll just have a quick check. Almost there. So I've now knit the 22 stitches of my heel flap. And instead of continuing on, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the work and get ready to purl back. But before I do that, I'm going to show you a little trick that I follow. I'm going to place an open stitch marker into the work after the row I've just made, and that marks the first row of my heel flap. And what's really useful when you place a marker like this is that it allows you to know how many rows you've done in your heel flap, because it's easy enough to count a full round, but when you're working them flat and you can't really tell where they were, where your rounds became rows, it can be a little bit tricky. So I find it really useful to use a marker. You can also use the marker then afterwards to know how many stitches you've knit in your leg, which will allow you to match your stitches together. And here's a sock I prepared earlier just to show this. So this is one I've done earlier, and that is where I placed the marker. So I knew that when I was knitting the sock to match it, I knew I needed 19 rows of stocking stitch. And that's just kind of a neat little thing, and you can also do that on the feet of your socks, and that'll tell you after you've finished your shaping and before your toe how many rows you need to knit as well. It's quite motivating as well when you come to knit your socks if you know how many rows you have, and it helps you avoid a little bit of second sock syndrome. So back to my heel flap. So I've knit across, and now on one side of my marker I have a set of stitches that I'm not going to touch. Those are your instep stitches, and it's really important to know that. So now I'm going to work back. I'm going to slip my stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. It's really important, and it is specified in the pattern, that you purl the stitch, that it's a slip stitch, and that you slip it purlwise. But make sure you slip those stitches, and why you do that will become really obvious when we show you the full flap and when we move on to do the gusset pickup. So I'm now just going to purl back, and as I've said before, this is to do with stocking stitch being knit flat. So instead of being all knit rounds, it's a knit row and a purl row. So you knit back to your marker, and then you can take the marker out as you come to it. Now it is a little bit fiddly, because with the sock wonder where you have one needle longer than the other, your little needle is not quite as usable as the longer needle, but it's something you get used to as you go. So I take away my marker, and now next time when I come back I'll be able to see the gap between them. As you can see here, it's much more obvious where that gap is. You can also count the stitches as you're knitting the rows to make sure you don't skip that gap, but it's very obvious where the gap is, and if you knit across it you will see a very definite hole. So you slip the yarn purlwise with the yarn in back this time, because you're going to be knitting the next stitch. So do that again, and then you knit across that row again. So that's how the heel is formed, with a slip stitch, knit a row, slip stitch, purl a row, although the first row is just all knit. So a little note about heels is that this is a plain stocking stitch heel. You get reinforced heels as well, like there's an Eye of Partridge heel, and the reason they're reinforced is that if you heels and feet of socks are where they would tend to wear out most quickly for most people. And here now you can just see the slip stitch. And the reason that you reinforce them is if you are heavy duty on them. I would knit a few pairs of socks and see how you wear them before committing to reinforced heels, because sometimes it can change the shape of your sock. And here I'm just showing you what will happen if it looks a bit funny when you slip your stitch with the yarn around it. It creates a little bump, which you don't want. You want it to be a very plain slip stitch. So now I'm going to work back across now another purl row, slipping it purlwise with the yarn in front and then purling the rest of this row. So just on the reinforced heels again, it isn't necessary and it can change the shape of your sock. And that's just showing you the slip stitch there again. We're going to continue working purlwise, and you can see my awkward little small needle. But if you don't want to swap to double pointed needles, which you could do your heel turn, which is how I do mine, then this needle is perfectly adequate for doing it. So you work across in purl. What you're going to be doing now is you're going to work all of the rows in the heel flap. I'm knitting the first size in the DK pattern, so I'll be doing 18 rows. So that'll be 9 knit, 9 purl. And then I will be coming on to do the heel turn, and I'll show you the flap before I do that. I'll just finish this row, show you what it looks like now, and then we'll skip forward a little bit to where I finish the flap. So here you can see that it's beginning to form already. You can see that it's going down along the back of the work. You can see that it's separate to the stitches on the other side, which you're doing nothing with, and you are now ready to continue working the flap to the length required in the pattern, and I will be back once I've that worked. So you have now worked all the rows in the flap, and you can see here now that it has grown all the way back down the back of the leg, and you have done all of your rows. And what's really interesting here is you will see at the side all of your slip stitches, and you will then also see that it goes down the back on half of the stitches, with the other half of the stitches unworked at the front. So here again you can see your marker and how useful it is for counting your rows. And that's it. That is your heel flap. We're now ready to work the heel turn, where you will take it from being vertical to being horizontal to go around the bottom of your heel. We're working down over from the flap into the heel turn now, and what we're going to do is we're going to get ready to work the heel turn. So we finished the flap yesterday, and now we're ready to turn. On the short circular needles, it can be a little bit fiddly, but it's worth it because you don't have to change needles. What you're doing is you're coming down out from the bottom of your heel flap, turning around the bottom of your heel, and you're doing that using a technique called short rows. They're not, for people who are worried about wrap and turn short rows, they are not. They're just really easy short rows. So the first thing you're going to do, and this is worked flat as well, only on the heel flap stitches that you've just done. So you knit across 15 stitches. It's about 3/4 of the way across the heel flap, and that is following that is following the smallest size pattern and the DK yarn. So if you're making a different size, you need to make sure you check the pattern, the heel flap and heel turn part of the pattern. So you're going to work across those 15 stitches, and when you come to that, you are going to do the next stitch as a slip knit. So that is slipping 2 stitches knitwise and then putting them back onto your left needle and knitting in through the back loops of those. And that creates a decrease on that side. And then you have going to turn your work, and on this side then you have 5 of your unworked stitches. And they are fine. That is exactly how they're supposed to look. The next thing you're going to do is if you slip 1 purlwise, and then you purl across 8 stitches, and that sets you up then because you're going across to the other side. Apologies, are a little bit off screen here, we're just purling across the 8 stitches. And then once you get to the other side, you are going to purl 2 stitches together, and this is this decrease on the other side of your heel flap, which matches the slip slip knit. So you've just purled those 2 stitches together, and you have 5 unworked stitches on the left hand side as well now. So they correspond to those on the right, and that is really important because that means you are putting the heel turn in the center of your heel flap rather than veering off to the left or the right. It's unlikely that you will ever knit a sock where you don't at some point veer off. That is just being a sock knitter. You just rip it out and start again. You just start the heel turn again. I wouldn't fudge it. It's not as fudgeable as other things in knitting. So you slip one purlwise with the yarn at back, and then you knit across your 8. So something you may see in other patterns is knit back to 1 before the gap rather than having a specific stitch count. What that means is there's a little gap between the last stitch that's been worked, and there's a gap between that and the unworked stitches. That's the gap they're talking about. So 1 stitch before the gap means that you come to the stitch before the unworked stitches essentially. What you're going to do at this point to bridge that gap is you're going to do a slip slip knit again. So you just slip that and you bridge your gap by slipping the other. These are the short rows that we're talking about because you're not working the full row. You knit those together and then you are going to turn your work again. You'll see that you have 4 unworked stitches now, so you've worked one of those unworked stitches from last time. So you turn the work, and then you slip 1 purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you purl 8. And again, if you see the instruction, purl to 1 before the gap. It's the same idea as before. You are just watching for the gap. But in my pattern it tells you how many stitches to do. Then you're going to purl these 2 stitches together, and then again that bridges your gap on this side, and you keep doing that across all of the rows in your heel turn, essentially until you work all of the stitches. So in the pattern that you have from me, it'll tell you how many stitches, it'll tell you how many rows to work, and in some patterns it will tell you until you have worked all of the stitches from the heel flap into the turn. So that's just to be aware that there are different ways in which this is written in different patterns. There's also different shapes of heel turn. So this is a square heel turn, some of them are round, and it depends on what you're doing. But again, your pattern that you're following will tell you. So slipping 1 purlwise, knitting across the 8 stitches, 1 before the gap. And I am just going to continue now until I'm on the last couple of rows of the heel turn, and I'll show you what that looks like then. So we've just come to the end, the last row of the heel flap, and I'm just going to show you there's no real difference in how this has worked. So you slip 1, knit 1 purlwise, and you knit across your 8 stitches. And once you get to the end, you're going to work the last stitch on the left hand side. So you're going to slip slip knit. Try not to let your needle run away from you. So you slip slip knit, and then that has worked the full side of your heel turn, and then you're going to turn the work, and then you're going to slip 1 purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you're going to purl back across those stitches, and then when you get to that you're going to find that you have all of the stitches worked as you come to the other side. And then you're just going to purl the 2 of those stitches together, and that will take you to the end of your heel turn. So you just purl these 2 together. And that is your heel turn fully worked on your sock wonder. So you can now see square heel. You can see that it goes down the back of your leg into your heel flap, around your turn, and your instep stitches are still the same. And you are now ready to pick up your gusset.